Hi everyone, my name's Catherine Stevens and I'm the Postgraduate Learning Consultant for the Centre for Teaching and Learning on the Manawatu campus for Palmerston North. And I'm going to be taking you through a session today that is on processing information. Now the point of this session is to focus on reading and note-taking efficiently and effectively, and the idea is that it will help you to organise yourself better, to make the best use of your time, and hopefully that means that you'll learn more in a smaller amount of time, and in the long run you'll produce better quality assessment and have better professional practices overall when it comes to handling information and literature in particular. So as a general rule, most of us, I think, have a tendency when we're managing information in the course of our research projects to just jump in, to just do whatever kind of reading practice and note-taking practice feels natural and normal to us. And the problem with this is that it can lead to a lack of organisation and a lack of time. When you're this character on the screen that we've got up here right now, just reading a single document, pretty well any process will probably work for you. The problem is that as time goes on over the course of your studies, the information starts piling up. And for a while you may stay on top of it, but I think for the vast majority of postgraduate students, where you eventually end up is in this kind of a situation, which we really want to avoid. And there's an additional challenge as well for those of you who are speaking English as something other than your native language, and who I know you will probably have varying degrees of fluency. The challenges then become a little bit higher again as you try to wade through a lot of material that is in English. So the main suggestion that I want to make today, I guess, is that you have a strategy, that you really think about the way you approach your information related activities in order to relate the activity to the outcome of the activity, so that you're taking an approach that is designed and intended to support a particular outcome, rather than just an approach that you have from habit. This will become a little bit clearer as we go on, but I just want you to pick up that main point there, that it's a good idea to have a strategy. Sorry, I've just got technological glitches already. Okay. So, when you are picking up a piece of literature and you're looking to work with it, the first thing I suggest that you do is evaluate the source. So what I mean by that is, where did you get this material from? Where has it come from? So if it's a journal article, what journal did it come from? And the types of things that you'll be wanting to consider when you're evaluating that are things like the quality of the journal or the quality of the publisher, if it's a book. For books, is that an academic publishing press that is well known? If it's one that you're not familiar with, sometimes it pays to do a little bit of research to make sure that that's a really good quality academic publishing press. If it's a journal, you might want to consider, is this a well-established peer-reviewed journal? You're probably all familiar with peer review, but just in case you're not, a peer-reviewed journal is one where the articles get sent away for what we call blind peer review, which means that experts, usually two experts in the field, will review the particular article without any knowledge of who the author is, and they will send it back with their feedback about the article, whether they think it's good enough quality to be published, whether they think changes should be made first, just all that kind of thing. So the idea is that once it's gone through the peer review process, there's a reasonable kind of guarantee that the article is of a reasonable quality for publication. So in addition to that, you may be wanting to think about things like the age of the research. Is this a fairly recent article, and if it's older, does that make a difference? Not all older research is necessarily less relevant or less useful because it's older, but it can be. So in a field where things change rapidly, or where there have been quite recent developments, the age of the research may matter a lot. Something that's been published in 2013 may be a lot more relevant than something that's been published in 2006. in some areas where the research is a little bit slower moving, or where there's not been any major recent discoveries, it may not matter so much if the research is starting to get a little bit older. But certainly you should be thinking of taking that into account. Its relationship to other research, that's quite often an important one. So again, if you've picked up a journal article, is this building on other research? Is it further supporting existing research that suggests quite similar types of findings? Is it debating or arguing previous findings from other research? You know, where does it fit into that broader context? And the type of study that it is will be relevant too. So the way that you approach a resource will depend quite a lot on what type of resource that is. So when I say that, I mean not just whether it's a journal article or a book, but also if, for example, it's a journal article, what type of journal article is it? So is it a research article where they've gone away and done a particular study? Have they done experiments? Have they done case studies? Is it perhaps a review article where they've taken an approach requiring a broad overview of the literature in that field in order to find out where the state of play is, as we call it, in that field. So where are things up to? What do we currently know, and what don't we currently know? So these types of things will be important. It's quite a long list of things that you need to take into account when you're evaluating a source. So that's just a few of the common ones. But I will put up a link at the end that will give you access to other information that can help you make those kinds of evaluations. Okay. So once you've actually picked up a text and you know that you're intending to look at it, the first thing you should really do before you start reading is decide what information you're actually looking for. So what I mean by that is that you pause to consider what it is that you're really needing in relation to your work or in relation to your research or your learning. Are you just trying to get an overview of a particular subject, for example, because you're wanting to understand it better? Are you looking for particular pieces of information that relate to particular topics? That might be the case if you were doing an assignment, for example, or a particular research project. So if you were, I'll see if I can come up with an example on the spot. If you were reading an article on lameness in dairy cows, you may not want to know everything about lameness in dairy cows. Maybe you might just want to know about fungal causes of lameness in dairy cows. So it's important to think about what it is that you're actually searching for ahead of time. And one of the reasons that it's important is because you don't really need to read all of every piece of literature you pick up. That's probably particularly obvious if you pick up a book. It's just not possible to get through every single book that you're likely to need to look at during the course of your studies. But even with journal articles, it's often not necessary to look at the whole thing. So once you've thought about what it is that you're wanting from that article, the next thing to consider is where will you find it? So which parts of the article are you likely to find that information? So you might want to start by considering what the usual structure is. If it's an article, what is the usual structure for that type of work? Just to give you a bit of a visual summary of what that might look like. You are probably already reasonably familiar with these sections, but if not, you might want to stop and have a quick read of what these different points suggest. They're just sort of outlining what you'll find in different parts of an article. Typically, every article tends to look a little bit different. They're not all perfectly laid out in exactly this fashion, and review articles tend to look quite different from this one. I've taken an example of a research article here, but the first place I would suggest you always start is the abstract. Once you've read the abstract, you've got a good idea of what the article is about in general. you may find at that point it's not even worth continuing to read at all. So that's one of the reasons it's particularly important to start with the abstract. Sometimes it just turns out that the article wasn't on the topic that you were hoping it was on. But after that, depending on what you're looking for, it may be best to just head straight on over to the conclusion. Don't be afraid to jump to the conclusion, it's not cheating. It's a good place to find out a little bit more about what the main points were that they covered. You may just want the literature review. Perhaps you're just wanting to get a good overview of where the literature is in this field. So maybe you're just wanting to quickly find out what this article found out plus what other articles have found out, in which case you might just read the conclusion and the literature review. So really think about what it is that you're looking for and where you might find it, and head to those parts of the article first so that you don't have to read the whole thing if it's not necessary. On occasion you may need to read the whole thing, particularly if it's very close to the subject matter that you're looking at. But a lot of the time it may be very possible to just skip through. Other approaches you can take too is look through the headings throughout the article and see if they help to give you shortcuts or an overview of what it covers. And in books you can take a fairly similar approach. You might want to have a quick look at the introduction and through the chapter headings, and skim through perhaps even the index at the end, just to see what type of information is in there and where you might find it. Okay, so once you've done that, let's say that you've done enough reading that you're wanting to start taking notes. It's a really good idea to stop and think about what the best way is to organise your notes in light of what your reason is for taking them. So there's a lot of different types, there's a lot of different reasons for taking notes on a particular text, and it pays to think about that when you're deciding how to organise your notes. It's pretty common for people to just have one standard way, I think, of note taking. Common options would include mind mapping. I see quite a lot of people using mind maps. That can be a lovely creative way of working out your ideas, particularly if you are a visual person who likes to look at images. Can be very useful, although you can't record a lot of information that way. And it can be useful for working out the relationships between different ideas or different pieces of information. It's fairly common for people to just take the actual article itself, print it out into hard copy, and then maybe write their own little comments in the margins. Certainly I used to do an awful lot of that as a postgraduate student. A lot of students get out the old highlighter and they highlight the most relevant parts of the text. Nothing wrong with these practices at all. They can be very, very useful in their place, but they do tend to have their limitations, which is that if you've taken the approach of just marking up the actual hard copy of your resource, or even the electronic copy of your resource, because you can now put notes on some electronic copies and highlights as well. The limitation of that is that at the end you've still got all that information just sitting somewhere inside the text. You haven't actually pulled it out yet. So before you can do anything useful with that information, you're going to have to reprocess it again in some way. You're going to have to go back through the text and pull that information out again, which does mean that you're double handling the resource. So that means you're handling the resource twice. That's something that I generally look for ways to avoid because it slows you down. And another one, perhaps one of the single most common practices I think for note taking is to just take a bunch of written notes, whether it's hard copy or whether it's electronically, on the particular author you're reading. So here's my Word document. I've labelled it with the author's name and with the name of the article, and now here's all the main points that came out of that article. I think that's very, very common for people to use that particular approach. Again, that can be useful. It's not that it's not got its uses, but it's awfully limited. So there are other approaches you can start to consider as well. So I suggest you start by deciding what type of information you need to record and why, And when I say why, I mean what is your aim? What are you actually trying to achieve? So are you wanting an overview of the subject for your own learning purposes, for example? Are you wanting to write a literature review, or are you wanting to answer a particular question within an assignment? The answers to those types of questions may affect the way you choose to note take. So what I want to do now is to take you through a couple of examples of ways to organize information that you may find helpful. Starting with what we call a literature matrix. So the example of one that of a literature matrix that I've just put up on the screen here. This has got an imaginary topic, causes of skin allergies in children. Everything on the screen is imaginary. Please don't think that any of it was actually in any way drawn from articles. But the important point is that I just want you to see how this is laid out. So up here on the on the top row, we've got authors. So in this first column, everything in here was written by has come from Sowerby, someone called Sowerby, that's their name. In the second row we have King, in the third row we have an author called Maru, and in the fourth row we've got Henriksen. So you put one author per column, and you record the name up in that top row there. Coming downwards on the left hand side here, we've got the topic. So in this first row down, we've got dietary allergens. So everything in this row here is on dietary allergens. Second row, we've got contact allergens, just coming along here, and then the third row we've got heredity. So this is to do with the inherited causes of allergies. Sorry, not quite sure what's going on there. Okay, so the point of this exercise is that it helps you to process information in relation to the way you received the information, rather than let me start that again. It helps you to process the information according to groupings of topics or ideas, rather than the way you received the information. So what I mean by that is if you were to read, let's say you were reading this first author here by the name of Sowerby, and you just made a Word document with all your notes from Sowerby in it, at the end you're still going to tend to think about that on the basis of what that author said about everything. It's going to be quite hard to compare it to any of the other authors that you've read. In this document though, because of the way it's been organized, if you put in everything that you read about Sowerby's findings in here, you can then, by the time you've done that for all of the articles you're reading, you can then read across. So you can easily compare what different authors have said about dietary allergens, and you can think of the information in relation to dietary allergens as instead of in relation to particular authors. So it gives you a bit of a snapshot, I guess, or a very easy way to process related information together, and to pick up, that will often help you to pick up key trends or key points of difference. And it also gives you a blueprint or map for going back to the information and finding it afterwards. There's a couple of things I want to quickly point out about this before we move on to another example. The first is that you'll notice that I have put in the page references for every single entry. So that is so that even though when you're doing your assignments, if you're using APA referencing, you wouldn't do that for paraphrased material. You would only do it for quoted material usually. When you're doing your literature matrix or your note taking, it's really important that you record your page reference every single time, so that you can really easily go back to the article or the book and find that material without having to hunt for it. It's very, very slow to have to try to find material twice. So find it once you've found it the first time, make sure you attach the page reference there so that you can get back to it easily. Remembering that this document is just for your own reference, it's not a piece of assessment. And the second thing I want to point out to you is that you'll notice in some places I've put quote marks. I strongly suggest if you're using this kind of a process, if you're lifting quotes out of a text just through copy and paste or something like that, you put quote marks around them straight away so that you know later on that that was not your language. There's quite a lot of accidental plagiarism, I think, goes on when students have forgotten which material was theirs and which was or which wording was theirs and which belonged to the author. So this is one way to help you avoid that. If you've taken a quote out, make sure you put quote marks around it. Even if you're never going to use the quote directly, still put quote marks around it just so you've got that point of reference there. Okay, so to look at take a look at how this might look in practice, I'm just going to bring up another document here. And I've got a missing piece of information on my screen, so I'm just going to go in and find that. Sorry, just bear with me, please. Okay. Just get this up and running. Okay. So I just want to show you a little bit more about how this literature matrix works in practice. Here we have got a journal article that Joanna has sent through to me that is on Japanese encephalitis and emerging zoonotic disease. So this article is a good example of one that you might come across in the course of your studies. I'm just going to block myself off the screen for a minute. Sorry, I will come back in a little bit. And show you how this matrix would work in practice if you were to do your own one. So if we were to, just going to have another go at that. If you were working your way through this article and you came to this piece of information here, which is giving prevalence in of the disease in particular areas of the world, or Asia specifically, you'll notice here that there's a statistic that says 21 to 40% in India. So in this literature matrix I've created over here, which is called Evaluation of Japanese Encephalitis, here's this article here. Here's the authors. It's Shekhar and Joshi, 2010. And here's the topics that I've created. Just going to make that a little bit easier to see here. Wow, that hasn't worked. Sorry, I'm having another technological glitch now. But if we come down here, you'll see that I've put prevalence of infection is 21 to 40% in India. Now, as it happens, I've just taken the India statistic. You might want to record what all of them were. You might just want to record one country. It would really depend on the purpose of your note-taking. So when you're recording the frequency of the disease, which is the topic that we've listed here, it would be you'd want to consider what to record in relation to what it is you're trying to achieve. So you don't need to take down every piece of information in that article. You just want to pull out the parts that are most important and then record them accordingly. And again, you'll notice that I've done page references for each piece of information. And this really is the exact same type of concept as the first example I used, except that I've done this particular document in Microsoft Excel because that's often a little bit easier to manage for this type of project. And up here you can see I've done a table on control options because that's one aspect of what I'm wanting to look at. And so we've got vaccination and we've got control farming there. And then lower down I've done a second table with impact of disease in people. So when you group the information like this, what you're effectively doing is making it very easy to process that information meaningfully afterwards. So here is everything that Shekhar and Joshi said that I thought was relevant, that I've wanted to summarise. Later on, I can talk about Burgess, who's the next article I'm intending to get to, and then Nguyen and Perrott listed over there. You'll notice down here I've sort of guessed that there's all of these articles are actually imaginary, these ones over here, but I've decided, well, yes, Burgess would still be relevant, and I'll be talking about Burgess in relation to impact of disease in people, or rather I'll be recording information from Burgess about that. But over here, I've changed the author from up here because Nguyen didn't say anything about the impact of disease in people, so I wouldn't be addressing them in this table. I'm not quite sure if I've explained that very clearly, but if not, we can discuss that further in our question and answer session later in the week. But I just want you to take a good look at that, the way that information is sort of laid out. There's no rules around how you do this really. It's because it's really just for your use. The idea is that you do it however will work best when you're grouping together information, and you only record the information that you need. The point is not to do a full summary of every article. The point is to pull out the information and record the information that you really need to use. Okay, so we'll just go back to our slides here. Okay, so just as a quick follow-on from that, another option. So, some people really love the idea of the literature matrix, where you're laying the material out in that kind of a table, and some people don't enjoy it quite so much. They don't really like things laid out in that kind of way. And sometimes if it's a very big subject, that can actually get a little bit overwhelming in terms of the amount of information in your table. So another way that you can do it is to do it in a good old Word document, like the one I've got on the screen here. I've done the same, looked at the same article here as an example. And this first category, which is on mosquito control, I've just recorded a little bit of information here from the Shekhar and Joshi article again. Exact same information, I've just put it under this heading in this Word document instead of in the Excel document. And down here I've created additional subheadings. There's vaccination in people, here's vaccination in pigs, here's control farming. So the idea is that you put the information under the relevant heading. So very similar principle to using that Excel document. One of the advantages of doing it this way, if you happen to like this method, is that it can very easily be used to start forming paragraphs. So at the moment I've just got the one piece of information from Shekhar and Joshi, but you can easily imagine that if I add in a couple of more bits of information, this is a slightly outrageous piece of information I've put down here, and an imaginary an imaginary product that's just going to annihilate all mosquitoes, kill all mosquitoes in the world. But you can see how if I recorded a bit more information here, Jones argues that it is preferable to focus on other forms of control as mosquito populations cannot be eradicated. Again, that's a completely imaginary piece of information, but you can see very easily it would be that you'd be able to start forming a paragraph that captured what the different perspectives were quite quickly from having captured the information like this in the first place. And what you can do too is you can very much treat this as a living document. So if, for example, you found that your section on mosquito control was starting to get too big, you were starting to get far too much information, you could then start breaking it into subsections. So perhaps you might, this is a very simplistic example, but you might suggest, you might change it to, the first section might be on methods of mosquito control, and the second might be arguments against the use of mosquito control, and then you can start processing your new information under these new headings. So the idea isn't that you use these headings in a fixed way. You can very much change them and mold them as you go, as it suits your purposes. Okay, we'll just get back to our PowerPoint screen here. Okay, and just one more point actually before we move on. The point at which you take notes can be quite important as well. I don't think there's only one right way to do it, but some people like to take notes as they go through the text. The advantage of that is that you don't have to look back over the text at all. You can very much just put information into your literature matrix or your document or whatever you're using, and then carry on, and you only look at the text once unless you have a particular reason to reread. Some people prefer to note take once they've finished the whole article, and that has a different advantage. The advantage of that is that it gives you a chance to make sure you've understood it all, really make sure you've understood the key points and can perhaps separate them from the sub-points or the things that aren't important at all, and that you can just capture those rather than getting caught up in small details, which can be one of the things that can happen if you're doing note-taking as you read. So it's worth weighing that up, and when you're thinking about what point to do your note-taking. It's certainly a very good idea to note-take within a fairly short period after you finish, at least. I wouldn't recommend that you read a text one week and then note-take on it the next, because you're effectively going to have to reread it again. So it pays to just weigh that up. If it was a very confusing piece of material, you may need to reread parts of it a second time, perhaps the next day, and then do your note taking. So it depends just a little bit on how you're finding the particular text. Excuse me. Okay, so another thing you might want to consider at the end, or that you definitely should consider at the end, is your or at whatever point you're doing note taking, is evaluating and critiquing. So if you recall at the, earlier on, I was suggesting that it's a good idea to evaluate the source of your journal in the first place, and how credible you think it is, how useful you think it might be, how reliable you might think the source is that it's come from. For once you've actually read the study, you will have a bit more information to add into your critique or your evaluation. So you might want to think about things like, these are just random examples, but how large was the study, because that can potentially affect how convincing the results are. Do you think the study was well designed? Were you really convinced by the methods, or could you see problems with the way they'd gone about in doing it? Are the claims in the article supported by the evidence that they've provided? Even in a peer-reviewed journal, you know, in a peer-reviewed journal article, we don't necessarily assume that the article is flawless. Even very advanced researchers sometimes make mistakes. Sometimes they make bigger claims than they can really support with the particular evidence that they've produced for that study. And this won't always be noticed, so it's a good idea for you to weigh this up for yourself. It's really easy if something's been published, particularly if it's been published by a very good journal, to assume that it must be right. But part of your job here as a postgraduate student is to really start weighing that up for yourself, and not being afraid to challenge or to ask questions about anything you can see that doesn't seem quite right. You may also want to consider things like, has it taken into account any conflicting evidence or research? One of the ways that researchers will sometimes make their arguments seem stronger or more convincing is by just ignoring conflicting evidence, perhaps from their own experiments or studies, or perhaps from other researchers. And it's a good idea for you to try to pay attention to that as well, because a good study will take into account conflict, and it will address that as part of its development of a convincing argument. So all these types of considerations should just become part of your standard reading and note-taking practice. You don't necessarily have to go through a specific question process with every article, and you don't have to record every piece of information about these types of questions. But if you see anything that's worth taking a note of, particularly if it suggests that the article is particularly useful or particularly good, or that the article may have problems, those are the types of things you should particularly pick up on and take notes on. Okay, so just coming towards the end here, one of the things I want you to think about is how are you going to remember what you read about a particular text further down the track. So what tends to happen in the beginning, well, not the beginning stages of research only, but throughout, is that when you read a particular article or a particular book, often you'll think that you will remember things later on that you won't remember. So while that little stack of books that we have on the left here may seem very memorable at the time that you read it, and you think you'll definitely remember what those texts were about, or what the authors had said, or the second one in the stack is absolutely no use at all and lacks any credibility. It may seem like you'll remember that in 6 months' time, but in 6 months' time you'll have perhaps a stack of books a bit more like the one on the right, that and they've all started to seem a little bit the same, or at least you've forgotten which one's which. So just as another point in terms of your note-taking, it's a good idea to work out some kind of system, and this may be part of your bibliographical database like EndNote, or it may be some other type of system, where you record crucial bits of information about what is useful to you and what is not. So just to give that a little bit more context, if you were, for example, doing a research project and you came across and you sort of made a list of 15 articles, and you read your way through the 15 articles and you recorded each one in EndNote, and you took notes about various ones. If one of those articles you didn't take notes on because you picked up the text and then discovered it wasn't useful after all, or you picked up the text and then thought, no, I just don't think this has got any credibility, I'm not going to use it, no one else has been citing it, so I don't really need to address it, it's just not important to what I'm doing, you still need to know that about that article in 6 months' time, or potentially a year's time, so that you don't end up tracking it down again and then having to reread it and then discover again that it was no use. So that type of information is quite tricky to record, and I think people generally often don't record it, but it can really be a real time waster if you end up looking for things twice or reading them twice. So I strongly recommend that you just think about how to keep a list of everything you've read, and how useful it was, and maybe that will be, you'll do that in EndNote. I find a fairly useful approach is just for this particular aspect of research, is just to keep a document that just summarizes everything I've read at a single glance, and that then creates a rating for each one of how important or useful it was. That's quite useful. Doesn't matter too much what approach you take, you just need one that's going to do that job for you. So you really want to basically record what you've read, so you've got a full list, whether or not it ended up being useful enough that you bothered to put it into EndNote, what information it contained roughly, what was its basic subject matter, and how useful it was. Okay, so the final point I really want to make is just that when you've finished all of your reading of a particular text, that you follow up on anything that you really should be following up on. So have you got questions about the text, things that you're not that you think have been left out, or you're wondering that you're wondering about. Um, if there's material that you think that you would need to follow up on in order to clarify the article. So, for example, if it has been a slightly confusing article and you're not really quite sure if you understood it well, one of your options may be to go and read one or two other bits of literature that will help. Or you might end up coming on to and asking questions on stream of your classmates to see if anyone else can help you to clarify a particular point. The main thing is though that you follow up and ask those questions or look for clarification at the time, because if you wait very long, you'll tend to lose that. Either you'll lose what you were wondering about, or you'll just and not be able to answer the question, or you'll just completely forget to follow up on it at all. And that can, over time, it's not always that helpful for your learning. It's really helpful if you can make sure you understand everything at the time. And I think that is particularly important if there's parts you haven't understood because the English was challenging, which can certainly be the case in scientific writing often. And the other thing too is one of the things you should be considering is how did it compare to other literature in this area. If you're reading several articles in a row that are on a related topic, often you'll start picking that up without even if you're not making a specific comparison. But sometimes it's helpful to really actually pause and consider how the article compares to other texts. Is it agreeing with them? Is it disagreeing with them? Is it proposing new solutions or new disease origins to those that are normally proposed? Where does it sit in relation to the other literature? Okay, so that's basically the point I wanted to the last point I wanted to get across. So the whole point, I guess, of this session is really that it comes back to taking a strategic approach, making sure that you're really thinking your way through the way you process information so that it works as well as possible for you, and aim as much as possible just to handle every piece of literature once or at the most twice, so that you're not spending more time than necessary on each particular piece. I've got a few links here that might be useful for you. These are all from Massey's OWL website. I think you'll probably be familiar with OWL by now. But there's material in there on note-taking, critical thinking and evaluation, summarising and paraphrasing skills, and English language and comprehension, and all of those might be useful to you in some ways when you're working through the process of reading literature and note-taking. So I hope that's been useful to you, and I will talk to you all later in the week. Okay, bye.